So let's talk about some of the biggest, scariest and most threatening units in all of Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some of the strongest units in the game, where I thought we'd rank up some of the biggest threats out there terrorising the tables, perhaps units that need a little bit of a balance recheck, and talk about what's making them so good right now. I last did a similar version of this around about 3 months ago. We did 5 of the strongest units back then, and here are the ones that were featured last time, 4 out of 5 of which have seen some fairly hefty nerfs since then. Hive Guards went up in points and then seemed to be completely changed in these new Leech Tyrannid Codex rules. Abaddon still remains monstrously efficient, though he is kind of let down by the Black Legion who he leads into battle. Dreadnoughts are still very solid, though they went up a little bit, and you can no longer spam 3 Grandmaster Dreadnoughts in the same list, which does limit them a bit. The Drukhari Talos lost core, and Covens in general had their -1 damage one toned down, so it no longer affects really high strength weapons. And the Ruckstruck Squig Buggy first got its nerf of being only able to take 1 unit of them, and then went up by quite a lot of points, so it's still good, but just not quite as amazingly efficient. For this video, I thought we'd talk about 4 entirely new different units, each from a different faction, talk about why I think they're good, and some of their most common synergies on the board. First up, I thought we'd start with an entry from this new Leech Tyrannid Codex that we've got. Of course, the Leech rules haven't been out for all that long yet, and it's still in a bit of an experimentation phase where people are trying to dig out the best combos in the book. It'll be interesting to see what builds emerge as tournament hotness for the Tyrannids, but I thought one particular standout damage dealer to talk about could be the Maleceptor. Maybe the other unit that I was seriously tempted to talk about would be the Harpy, but seeing as we talked about that in a Good Flyer video recently, I thought we'd go for this guy. I'll leave a link to the Harpy video down in the video description. In any case, the Maleceptor is the Tyranid's big Psycho Bug, 170 points, and seems like a fairly sturdy centerpiece to the army, having 15 wounds, toughness 8, a 3+ armor save with a 4+ invul from its psychic shielding, and seems like a fairly reasonable anvil unit to have in the center of your battle line. There's a few ways that you can make it even tougher than that. High Fleet Leviathan can have it only wounded on a 4+, as it's a synapse beastie. That means that even the heaviest anti-tank weapons are going to struggle with it just a little bit more. Plus it's got its own psychic action that you could do as it's getting into position, having -1 strength to the enemy guns, which both applies to it and the nearby units. I guess you could also cast Catalyst on it for a 5+ feel no pain, or you could use Crusher Stampede for -1 damage. Both of those seem pretty solid as well. In any case, perhaps the reason that the Maleceptor is quite so interesting is that it can just chuck out a fairly insane amount of mortal wounds when it gets close, likely to be hoovering up entire units worth of models, and then even after that can double down with a charge and a little bit of melee damage if the psychic didn't do enough. At base, the Maleceptor can cast 2 psychic powers, and can cast an additional one for just 1 CP, and every cast over Warp Charge 7 triggers its special rule, which means it throws another 3 mortal wounds out towards the nearest enemy within 12 inches. Even if that ability was just a regular psychic power, a Warp Charge 7 spell for 3 mortal wounds would be great, so it kind of feels every time it casts a spell, it's sort of casting a second spell at the exact same time, and you can just throw out tons and tons of mortal wounds with this. For the choice of psychic powers, it might kind of depend on what you're trying to do with the rest of the army, but if you were just going at the absolute most basic level and wanting to throw out lots of damage at the enemy, you can cast 2 of Psychic Scream, Neuroparasite, or Smite, and then pay 1 CP to cast the other. Just at base, with no extra buffs or anything, then you're averaging around about 10 mortal wounds on a typical target, though it does vary a little bit depending on what you hit with Neuroparasite, so even that just by itself is pretty crazily threatening. That's 10 1-wound infantry just evaporated, or potentially doing massive damage to something like a battle tank. That's only kind of base entry with 1 command point though. You could easily buff that with something like the Neurothrope's Warp Siphon ability. That's the synaptic link that makes 1 model cast on 3d6 drop the lowest, and that combines absolutely beautifully with the Warp Charge 7 thing, meaning that it's really likely to go off. Just with my rough napkin math, that averages you around about 13 mortal wounds on your target. It can get even stronger than that though, depending on what synaptic imperatives you're using for the army. You could either use the Neurothropes one for a +1 to cast on all those powers, making them yet more reliable to get that 7, or you could potentially use the Maleceptor's Psychic Action one, which allows him to do a psychic action while casting a bunch of powers. That could give you another shot at getting another 3 mortal wounds out, as well as that shielding ability. The threat range isn't really too bad either. You could advance and cast all these powers, which means that with an average advance roll you should be hitting a unit within 24 inches with this deluge of mortals. It does feel like a threat that your opponent's really going to struggle to ignore, and really quite a tough one if they do want to focus it down as well. Then, if you've chosen not to advance, you could still potentially charge after that. The melee stats aren't exactly spectacular, but they should still be able to do some reasonable damage. You either get 3 attacks at strength 10, AP minus 4, damage 2d3, or 6 attacks for clearing infantry at strength 7, AP minus 3, and damage 2. Even just with that one, you're still likely to be killing a fair few Space Marines or something. If you are going for maximum mortal wound output though, you could use that Horned Chitin stratagem for 1 command point on the charge, and that'll average you another 3 mortal wounds, just in case the 13 or so that you'd done already wasn't already good enough. Overall, it's looking to be a very scary unit. I would bear in mind there's plenty of other Tyranid things that look fairly terrifying as well. As I mentioned, I do feel those Harpies are going to be a popular choice. Multiple flavours of Hive Tyrant look nice, as do the Exocrines with their massive damage 3 output. Next up, out of our top 4 massive threats, we've got the Tau Empire Crisis Battlesuits. Perhaps not a particularly surprising choice, given Tau's recent dominance in the meta, and the fact that these guys can be used in quite a few different ways to massive effects. If you just want straight damage dealing, Plasma Rifles, Cyclic Ion Blasters, and Tau Flamers are all excellent against their targets, though Airbursting Fragmentation Projectors are another really popular choice. Ignores line of sight means that you're basically always going to be able to hit what you need to, and each suit could be spitting out 2d6 strength 4, AP minus 1, and damage 1 shots. The buffs that they have access to truly are great though, particularly that Warlord trait for re-rolling wound rolls within 12 inches that makes all of their guns so much more efficient. Montcar also provides a damage buff against their nearest targets. The AP minus 1 helps out some weapons like the Tau Flamer. Markerites will have them hitting on 3s a lot of the time, and the regular Crisis Commander's buff to ignore modifiers is also quite powerful as well against certain enemies. Then perhaps 2 of the more popular Septs are either Tau Sept or Farsight Enclaves. Tau Septs can combine fire for a +1 to wound against certain targets, or Farsight Enclaves do the really big deep striking thing crazily well. 3 CP to have a massive unit of really threatening crisis suits casually reroll all hits and wounds against their targets. That one certainly has the potential to double their damage output against certain things. I think what's making these generally a bit more popular than broadsides though is the fact that they're really quite mobile. They get 10-inch movement at base, will often be in Montcar for advancing and shooting without penalty. It means that they're really quite likely to be able to get some targets even on turn 1 through moving fast, and they do also have the potential to be deep struck on turn 1 as well via a stealth suit team using a homing beacon. That would work very nicely with those Farsight big rerolls. As if being fast and dangerous weren't quite enough though, their defense is also pretty solid as well. They're going to be a really annoying unit for a lot of factions to take out. Shield generators seem to be a really popular choice. 5 points for a 4+ invul means that each suit is now toughness 5, 4 wounds, and a 4+ invul save, and can also get cover as infantry as well. Then add a stack of maybe 5 shield drones to the unit, and you're going to be chewing through a whole bunch of toughness 4 bodies with a 4+ invul as well, and 2 wounds each. They'll often eat up the first barrage of damage against them very nicely. Then you've got fancier upgrades like Iridium suits for 2+ saves on key targets, Stim injectors for a temporary 5+ feel no pain, which often has the potential to save at least 1 battlesuit from a round of shooting, 1 or 2 command points to jump shoot jump, so you move out, fire away, and then hide behind terrain again, making them very hard to engage in the first place. And they're even kind of resistant to melee as well. If you tag them, they can still shoot, and Crisis Commanders can also let them fall back and shoot as well if you have one of those. They really are quite a big investment piece that does need to be built around, but they've just got so many crazy advantages going for them that it's perhaps not too hard to see why Tau players are bringing quite so many of them to the table. Otherwise for Tau, maybe the other units I'd be most tempted to talk about will be Commanders or Broadsides, both of which are very efficient for their own roles as well. Next up for the Custodies we have Vertus Praetors. I'll admit in reality for the points cost Trajan Valoris does outperform these, but I have talked about him a few times on the channel. Feel free to check out my Adeptus Custodes tier list that I made. Trajan Valoris basically gets his own tier. He's just insanely strong for some of the crazy things that he provides for 160 points. Still though, for this one I thought we'd talk about one of the Custodes' other very efficient units, which arguably might have even more impact on the table, just because they're often taken in multiples, so they might have a bit more impact on the battle than any one model, even if it's super efficient. The Vertus Praetors are the Custodes' jet bikes equipped with salvo launchers normally, 85 points, and basically bring some much needed speed and manoeuvrability to the relatively slow stomping Custodes' foot troops. They do give up objective secured for the privilege, but that's hardly different from most of the other factions' damage dealers, and with that massive 14-inch move and fly, they've got a very decent chance of just jumping onto objectives and obliterating whatever stood there anyway. The threat range is just kind of horribly long. They either have the potential just for straight up rushing the enemy as fast as they can, or jumping behind multiple pieces of terrain, and being a massive countercharge threat if the opponent puts units anywhere in their threat range. I think Vertus Praetors are a good example of what happens when you make a unit both very fast, very dangerous, and very tough in 40k. Kind of a real lack of downsides there. You might well struggle to shift them with toughness 6, 5 wounds, a 2+ armor save, a 4+ invul, and also a 4+ save against mortal wounds in Emperor's Chosen, which is perhaps one of the stronger ways to run them. Even if they're targeted with excessively heavy weapons as well, they can also draw access to transhuman physiology, a 1 CP to only be wounded on a 4+. Being a very similar profile to the rest of the army, they're going to stretch the opponent's firepower for dealing with Custodes even further. Then they also provide a very solid ranged option for the Custodes. Each guy gets a salvo launcher shot at strength 8, AP 4, and damage D3 plus 3, which might not sound all that much for an 85-point model, but they are unusually reliable. They hit on 2s, they might often have a Dawn Eagle captain running alongside for some reroll 1s, and then in Emperor's Chosen they also get to reroll 1 wound roll as well, meaning that even a small squad of 3 of them firing those launchers against a standard toughness 7 vehicle without an invul, they average around about 11 wounds on it, obviously swinging a fair bit depending on how many of those salvo launcher shots convert. Theoretically though, you're getting a crazy amount of anti-tank firepower, considering they can also fight well in melee. Speaking of which, in combat they get 4 attacks at strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2, all usually with a +1 to wound on the charge, which I think they normally will be doing, and their Misericordia attack also became free in the latest chapter approved as well. Against ideal targets without invul saves, that'd be around about 7 dead marines or 12 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. They will suffer a fair bit against anything with -1 damage though, so there are definitely targets that they prefer to be fighting over others. Overall, it's not too hard to see why a fair few lists tend to run 3 units of 3 of these. They're definitely not the only way to play Custodes. You can definitely lean hard into the Dreadnoughts or the Custodian Guard, and just in terms of raw efficiency, Trajan Valoris and the Shield Captains definitely compete as well. But I don't think there's going to be many armies that aren't going to see these Vertus Praetors as an absolutely massive threat. They are at least fairly terrifying. Finally, and perhaps a really unsurprising choice to people who have been keeping track of tournaments, Harlequin Voidweavers are maybe one of the single most obvious units in all of 40k that just seems plain undercosted for the amount of abilities that it brings, and is a very easy choice indeed for Harlequins or Eldari lists to spam either 6 or 9 of them. These things really might not do all that much significant melee, but they certainly combine monstrous speed, massively heavy firepower, and also being really annoying to shift for their profile. Like with the Vertus Praetors, if you're going to make it fast, strong, and tough, you do need to reflect that in the points value, otherwise they're just going to get played all the time. For their movement, being a very zippy Eldar skimmer, they're 16 inches base, and most people tend to play them in the Sadath of Light, which just synergizes amazingly with Voidweavers. They auto advance 6 inches, and Light can mean that you can advance those 6 inches and still fire as if you were stationary. It means you can basically get absolutely optimal positioning with these, zipping around 22 inches, peeking out of cover and maybe just getting line of sight on the things that you need, and hopefully staying well safe from enemy reprisals while you're doing so. Even if one unit finds itself a bit out of position, it can fire and fade to stay safe, and the light capricious reflection stratagem is also insanely horrible as well. When you charged, it can move 6 inches, potentially making these almost impossible to charge from deep strike. From there you've got really heavy firepower at 36 inches with the prism cannon, or 24 inches with the shuriken cannons. The prism cannon's really quite general purpose, 2 quality anti-tank shots each at strength 12 AP 4 damage 2d3, or it can trade it out for 3d3 strength 5 AP 3 damage 1 anti-infantry shots. That sort of thing is going to hoover up things like Sisters of Battle really nicely. Then you also get 2 general purpose shuriken cannons, 6 shots at strength 6 AP 1 and damage 2, with getting extra AP on 6s. Between those two quite different profiles, it does mean that Voidweavers are basically fairly effective against literally anything that they fire against, another reason that makes them so good for being spammed. Then, as mentioned, they really are quite truly annoying to remove. Like a fair few Harlequins, their base stats don't seem all that impressive for the points, 6 wounds, toughness 5 and a 4+ save. On paper it sounds like that would get wrecked pretty easily for 90 points. In reality, as mentioned, you're often going to struggle to draw line of sight to them or struggle to charge them. But even when you do, they've got really quite a lot of debuffs and defensive rules, a 4+ invul, -1 to hit and no rerolls when you're targeting them, and to make those invul saves even more annoying, the Luck of the Laughing God rerolls are a really good target here, potentially allowing them to just reroll some really high damage shots and shrug them off. If you're playing them in the light Sadath as well, it also means that hit rolls of 1 to 3 always fail regardless, so even super accurate things like Adeptus Custodes will only be hitting these on 4s and not getting any rerolls. Then if you did want to add a Shadow Seer into the heart of a swarm of these, it could add even more defensive buffs. You don't get the -1 to wound shield from harm thing, but they can use Mirror Architects to make enemy guns count as being 6 inches further away. That's quite horrible for deep striking things with 12-inch range like flamers or melter guns, and can also provide a 6+ feel no pain via psychic power. They're perhaps one of the clearest units at the moment, where if you just spam a crazy bunch of them, you're almost certainly going to be at a big advantage over your opponents. A ridiculously efficient datasheet that combines very well with the Harlequin's other options. In particular, I think certain Death Jester builds or the standard troops and Starweavers both could be at least reasonably close competitors for the Voidweaver in terms of efficiency. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a quick breakdown of some of the very strongest and nastiest threats in Warhammer 40k at the moment. Certainly the latter three I think could all use a bit of a points bump. Maybe it's a little bit harder to say with the Maleceptor, seeing as technically the Codex isn't out. They do seem to bring a ridiculous amount of threat and utility though for those 170 points. Let me know what you think of these, and if there's any other units that you think I might have mentioned on this list. I'm sure it's a topic that we'll be revisiting at some point in the future. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's what allows me to keep on making all these videos quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.